On the morning of October 14, 2003, a school bus carrying 14 fifth graders from Fern Hollow Elementary, along with their teacher, Ms. Adele Farrow, and driver Grant Wexler, left the school parking lot at 8:15 a.m. bound for the Cedar Ridge Outdoor Education Center, 41 miles up a winding mountain road. It never arrived. By noon, when the center called the school to ask where the group was, a search had already quietly begun. By nightfall, it was the largest search and rescue operation the county had ever mounted. By the following week, it was a case with a task force, a tip line, and a growing, unbearable silence where answers should have been. No bus, no wreckage, no bodies, no ransom note. 14 children and 2 adults had left a parking lot in broad daylight and simply ceased to exist. 22 years later, in the dry, terrible heat of an August wildfire season, the mountain gave them back. Detective Renata Cole had been 11 years old in 2003, 2 grades behind the missing class, close enough in age that she still remembered the assembly where the principal had tried, and failed, to explain to a gymnasium full of children why 14 of their classmates weren't coming back. She had grown up in the shadow of that unfinished story, the way some people grow up in the shadow of a war. It shaped the town without anyone needing to say its name out loud. She was 33 now, a detective with the state police's cold case unit, when the Kestrel Ridge wildfire, the worst in the county's recorded history, burned 4,000 acres of the mountain's western face and, in doing so, exposed a service road that hadn't appeared on any map since the 1970s. And at the end of that road, a structure that had been built, deliberately and expensively, to never be found. The fire crew that stumbled onto it thought at first it was an old mining operation, a low concrete bunker built into the hillside, its roof buried under decades of soil and brush that the flames had finally stripped away. It was the ventilation pipes that made the incident commander radio it in as something worth a second look. 6 of them, spaced with obvious design, still faintly humming with airflow. Something down there was still breathing. Renata arrived by helicopter 4 hours later, before the fire had even finished smoldering out a quarter-mile away. What the tactical team found when they forced the reinforced steel door was not a mine, and not a bunker in the way the word usually meant. It was a compound, 3 underground levels, poured concrete and steel, water and power systems independent of any grid, dormitories, a classroom, a chapel-like common room with a single mural painted across an entire wall. And people, living people, blinking against flashlight beams they hadn't needed in years, some of them in their 30s now, and one of them, an old man with a long gray beard and eyes that showed no fear at all, standing in the center of the common room as if he had been expecting this exact moment for a very long time. "You found us," he said, when Renata's flashlight found his face. "I always wondered which generation it would take." His name, according to the driver's license found in a locked filing cabinet on the compound's 2nd level, was Elias Thorne. He was 68 years old, and the documents recovered from that cabinet, journals, ledgers, a self-published manifesto he had apparently printed on a hand-cranked press somewhere in that underground warren, told a story that took investigators weeks to fully piece together. Thorne had been, in the 1990s, a moderately successful survivalist author and lecturer, the kind of man who spoke at gun shows and self-reliance expos about the coming collapse of the American power grid, the food supply, the social order itself. He had a small but devoted following. He had also, according to court records unearthed later, been quietly investigated twice in the late 1990s for attempting to recruit children into what one complainant's file called an isolated survival education program. And both times the investigations had gone nowhere for lack of evidence. By 2001, Thorne had purchased, through a shell corporation, 1,100 acres of undeveloped mountain land above Fern Hollow, land that happened to sit less than 6 miles from the access, road the Cedar Ridge Outdoor Education Center's buses used every autumn. He had spent 2 years, and investigators would later estimate close to $4 million of an inherited fortune building the compound beneath it, all before a single child ever went missing. "He didn't kidnap us in the way people think," said one of the survivors, a woman named Colette Marsh, during her first formal interview with Renata 3 days after the rescue. Colette had been 9 years old on the bus in 2003. She was 31 now, though something in the way she held her hands in her lap, folded and still, made her seem both older and much younger at once. "He didn't grab us off a street corner. He redirected the bus." It took investigators most of a week, working from Thorne's own meticulous ledgers, to reconstruct exactly how 14 children and 2 adults had vanished from a mountain road without anyone seeing a single sign of struggle. Thorne had spent nearly a year, according to his own notes, studying the Cedar Ridge route, the timing of the buses, the 2-lane road's blind curves, the single stretch roughly 9 miles up, where a logging spur split off from the main road and where, in 2003, there had been no cell coverage and almost no other traffic on a weekday morning. On October 14, a construction detour sign, professionally printed and mounted on legitimate-looking sawhorses, had redirected the bus off the main road and onto that logging spur. A detour that, investigators confirmed decades later, had never been authorized by the county and had been removed, along with all physical evidence of it, within hours of the bus disappearing. Grant Wexler, the driver, had followed the sign without hesitation. There was no reason not to. 3 miles up the spur, where the road narrowed and the forest closed in on both sides, the bus had been stopped, not by force, the surviving testimony suggested, but by what appeared to be a second, uniformed man waving them down, claiming to be a forest ranger, warning of a downed tree ahead and offering to guide them to an alternate route. That man was Elias Thorne. "He was so calm," Colette said. "Ms. Farrow trusted him immediately. That's the part nobody understands. He didn't have to threaten anyone. He just had to be believable for about 4 minutes, and then it was too late." What happened in those 4 minutes, and in the hour that followed, remained partially reconstructed even after everything else came to light. Thorne's own journals grew evasive at exactly this point, as if even he hadn't wanted a full record of it. What was certain, from both physical evidence at the second, smaller structure eventually found a half-mile from the compound and from survivor testimony, was that the bus had been driven off the spur road entirely, down a concealed grade to a hidden clearing, where it had been methodically stripped, disassembled, and buried. The same bus, investigators would later confirm through a recovered chassis number. That fire crews had first mistaken for old mining debris a quarter-mile from the compound's ventilation shafts. Ms. Farrow and Mr. Wexler, the 2 adults, had not survived that first year. Thorne had called it the Ark, in the way he called everything by names that made his actions sound like scripture rather than crime. His manifesto, recovered from the compound's second level and running to nearly 300 handwritten pages, laid out a philosophy that Renata found, reading it late into her 3rd night on the case, almost unbearable in its calm, methodical self-justification. The world above, Thorne had written, was already ending, not through some single catastrophic event, but through a slow collapse of everything that mattered: community, self-sufficiency, meaning. He believed, or claimed to believe, that children raised entirely outside that collapsing world, untouched by its television and its consumerism and what he called its manufactured hopelessness, could grow into the founders of something better. A new town, a new way of living. He needed, his own words made clear, a founding generation young enough to be shaped completely, and old enough to remember nothing else once they were. 14 children had fit that description perfectly, in a single bus, on a single morning, in a town small enough that no one would ever think to look at a wealthy recluse's mountain property 41 miles away. For 22 years, those children, and the adults they grew into, had lived beneath the mountain on a rotation of lessons Thorne designed himself. Survival skills, A curriculum of his own selected history and literature, physical labor maintaining the compound systems, and a nightly ritual in the common room beneath that mural, where Thorne would speak for an hour about the world above and why it could never be trusted again. Not all 14 had survived to be found. 2 boys, according to compound records and later confirmed through recovered remains, had died in the first 2 winters, one of untreated appendicitis, one in what Thorne's own journal described only as the accident with the generator, a phrase Renata would spend months trying and mostly failing to get anyone to elaborate on. A third child, a girl named Priya Anand, had vanished from the compound itself in 2011, at age 17. Whether she had died attempting to escape through the mountain's unmapped cave systems, or successfully vanished into a world that had already stopped looking for her, remained, even after everything else was resolved, one of the case's few permanent unknowns. The remaining 11, 9 of the original children, grown now into adults between 30 and 34, and 2 who had been born beneath the mountain to survivors during the compound's middle years, children who had never once in their lives seen the sky, were the ones fire crews found alive in August. Among the survivors was a man named Desmond Okafor, who had been 10 years old on the bus in 2003 and was 32 now, and who, unlike several of the others, remembered everything. Some of them stopped remembering on purpose, he told Renata, during an interview conducted, at his request, not in a police facility but in the open air of a state park 3 days after his rescue, because he had told the negotiating officer that if he had to spend 1 more hour under any kind of ceiling, he thought he might lose his mind entirely. Thorne rewarded forgetting. If you stopped asking about your parents, stopped drawing pictures of your old house, stopped using your birth name, you got privileges, better food, more time in the upper rooms with the skylights he'd built. I decided early on I wasn't going to forget, even if it cost me everything he was offering. How did you manage that for 22 years? Desmond was quiet for a while, looking out at trees that hadn't been burned, at a sky he had apparently spent very little time beneath for over 2 decades. I built a version of the bus ride in my head, he finally said. Every single night before sleep I'd run through it, the seat I sat in, the song on Miss Farrow's little radio, the smell of Colette's strawberry gum 3 seats up. I made myself remember all of it, over and over, because Thorne's whole plan depended on us forgetting there had ever been anything else. Remembering was the only rebellion I had left. It was Desmond's memory, more than any physical evidence, that eventually let investigators reconstruct not just the how of that October morning, but the who, the exact sequence of the fake detour, the second man at the logging spur, even, eventually, the name of a hardware store 2 counties over where Thorne had purchased the sawhorses and the printer paper for the detour signs. A purchase confirmed through a receipt found, absurdly, still tucked into the back pages of Thorne's own ledger. Kept as what he apparently considered a kind of founding day relic. He kept everything, Desmond said. He thought history would want a record of what he built. I don't think it ever crossed his mind that the record would be used to convict him instead of celebrate him. The mural in the compound's common room, the one that had faced the survivors every night for 22 years during Thorne's ritual gatherings, showed a stylized mountain, a sun rising behind it, and at the base of the mountain, 14 small figures rendered in flat, deliberate style, standing in a row with their arms linked. It was, Renata initially assumed, simply Thorne's self-mythologizing proof of his belief that he had founded something significant. But when she brought a photograph of the mural to Colette Marsh during a later interview, Colette's reaction told her it meant something else entirely to the people who had lived beneath it. "We painted that," Colette said. "Not him, us. The first year before he'd fully broken any of us down, 5 of the older kids got permission to paint something on that wall, and we made it look like what he wanted to see, the mountain, the sunrise, the united little founders he was so proud of. But look at the hands." Renata looked. In the photograph, each of the 14 small figures' linked hands weren't quite touching. A hair's width of blank wall separated every pair of painted fingers, so subtle it read, at a glance, as simply the folk art style of amateur child artists. "We did that on purpose," Colette said, "every single year. Whoever got picked to touch up the mural for maintenance kept that gap exactly the same. It was the one thing in that whole place that was ours instead of his. We told him it symbolized how close we all were. What it actually meant was that none of us had really joined hands with what he was building. Not really. Not once, the whole 22 years." Renata thought about that gap of blank wall for a long time after the interview ended. A quarter-inch of defiance, painted and repainted for 2 decades by children who had grown into adults without ever being allowed to say the word out loud. While investigators worked the compound, a separate and in some ways more difficult reckoning was happening in Fern Hollow itself, where families who had spent 22 years assuming the worst were now being asked, gently and then not so gently by a swarm of state troopers and reporters, to absorb the fact that the worst had not, in fact, been true, that their children had been alive within driving distance the entire time. Renata sat across from Colette Marsh's mother, Diane, in the same living room where, in October 2003, Diane had waited by a phone that never rang with the news she needed. Diane was 61 now. She had kept her daughter's bedroom essentially untouched for over 2 decades. The same posters, the same bedspread, worn soft from being sat on by a mother who visited it more nights than she would ever admit to anyone. "I used to drive up that mountain road," Diane said, "every October 14th for the first 10 years. I'd park at the spot where they said the bus went missing and I'd just sit there. I told myself I was looking for answers. I think really I just wanted to be as close to her as I could get." She pressed a tissue to her eyes, laughing in a way that had no humor in it at all. She was 3 miles from that spot the whole time. 3 miles, detective, for 22 years. The reunion, when it finally happened 2 weeks later at the county hospital, where the survivors had been under observation, was not the tidy, tearful embrace the news cameras outside had clearly been hopping for. Colette stood in the doorway of the family visitation room for nearly a full minute before she could make herself cross it. And when she and Diane finally held each other, it was with the careful, almost startled gentleness of 2 people relearning a language they had once spoken fluently and had gone decades without using. "I kept your room exactly the same," Diane told her once they'd both stopped shaking. "I don't know why. I think I never let myself believe it was really over." "I'm glad you didn't," Colette said. "I don't think I would have known how to come home to a stranger's house." Elias Thorne was charged with 14 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of felony murder tied to the deaths of the 2 boys in the compound's early years, and once the state's forensic team finished reconstructing the events of October 14, 2003, 2 additional counts of murder for the deaths of Adele Farrow and Grant Wexler, whose remains were eventually located in a sealed chamber on the compound's lowest level, alongside personal effects investigators matched to both adults through dental records and jewelry family members were able to identify. Thorne showed no remorse throughout the 16-month legal process that followed, and in fact seemed, according to courtroom reporters who covered every session, almost proud of what he had built. A man convinced to the end that history would eventually recognize him as a visionary rather than what a jury of 12 Fern Hollow-adjacent citizens ultimately, and unanimously, determined him to be. "I gave them a world without the lies you're all still living in," he told the court during his only statement, delivered flatly, without any apparent awareness of how it would land in a room full of parents who had spent 22 years grieving children. He had simply relocated 3 miles up a mountain. "You'll understand, eventually, when the collapse finally comes for the rest of you the way I always said it would." He was sentenced to life without parole. He was 70 years old by the time the final appeal was denied, and Renata, who attended that last hearing at Diane Marsh's quiet request, thought he looked for the first time in the entire process, less like a prophet and more like exactly what he was. An old man who had built an elaborate, terrible fiction rather than face an ordinary life, and who had cost 14 children the only childhoods they would ever get in order to sustain it. Not every survivor's return unfolded the way Colette's did. Two of the grown former children chose, in the months following the rescue, to keep almost no contact with the families who had spent over 2 decades mourning them, unable to reconcile a stranger's grief with a childhood they had, in some genuinely complicated way, also grown up inside. One of the case's harder truths, which the department's victim services team spent years afterward trying to help both survivors and families understand. That trauma does not erase the fact of having lived an actual, if stolen, life in the meantime. The 2 children born beneath the mountain, a boy named Silas, age 9, and a girl named June, age 6, both born to survivors during the compound's later years and both raised entirely within Thorne's philosophy without ever having chosen it, presented the investigation's most delicate question of all. They had never been reported missing, because no one outside the compound had ever known they existed. They emerged into a world with no birth certificates, no medical records, no legal identity whatsoever, and a vocabulary built entirely around a mountain and a mural, and a rotation of lessons about a collapse that had never actually come. Desmond Ackafer, who had helped raise both children during the compound's final years, petitioned the state for temporary guardianship of both, while their case moved through family court, a request the judge granted within a month, citing what she called, in her written opinion, the singular, irreplaceable nature of the trust these children had already built with the one adult in the compound who consistently protected their well-being, even under Thorne's authority. "I never got my own childhood back," Desmond told Renata, the last time she interviewed him for the case file, watching Silas and June chase each other across an actual, unguarded stretch of grass outside the guardianship housing the state had arranged. "Nobody can give me those 22 years. But I can make sure these 2 get to have theirs, out here, in the open, the way it should have always been for all of us." 2 years after the wildfire that uncovered the Ark, the state demolished the compound entirely, sealing the ventilation shafts and collapsing the underground levels rather than leave them standing as what several survivors, testifying at the public hearing on the demolition, called a shrine some future version of Thorne's followers might try to rebuild. In their place, the county built a small memorial at the trailhead nearest the old logging spur, 14 names carved into a low stone wall, along with the names of Adele Farrow and Grant Wexler, and beneath all 16 names, a single line the survivors themselves had chosen together, after months of disagreement about how, or whether, to summarize what had happened to them at all. They were not lost, they were taken, and some of them came home. Renata drove up to that trailhead the following October 14th, the 24th anniversary of the morning the bus first disappeared, and found Diane Marsh already there, sitting on a bench facing the mountain, with Colette beside her, and a short distance away, Desmond crouched in the grass helping Silas identify the different birds calling from the tree line. A sound, Desmond had told Renata once, that had taken the boy nearly a year to stop flinching at. After a childhood spent underground where every unfamiliar noise had been treated, by necessity, as a threat. "You come up here every year?" Renata asked, settling onto the bench beside Diane. "Every year," Diane said. "For 22 years it was a vigil for someone I thought was gone. Now it's something else. I'm not sure there's a word for what you call it when the thing you mourned for 2 decades turns out to have been alive the whole time, 3 miles up a road you drove past 1,000 times without knowing." Colette reached over and took her mother's hand, the way, Renata thought, watching them. She had probably once linked hands with 13 other children in a mural on a wall that no longer existed. A 1/4 inch of defiant, deliberate space closed at last. 22 years and one mountain too late, but closed all the same. In memory of every child a mountain kept, and every family that never stopped listening for the sound of a bus that was already 3 miles closer than anyone dared to hope.